Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Luke Johnson and my friend Sophie Liqueur. We are going to be talking about John Keats, the great Romantic poet. Specifically, we're going to be talking about his poem To Hope. We're going to be analyzing it today. Sophie, I'm so glad that you're doing this with me. I have some notes prepared, but really this is going to be an unscripted, spontaneous conversation. So anything can happen. So buckle up, brace yourself for a rip-roaring poetry analysis session. Is there anything that you would like to say before we get into the text?
No, except that I was very moved when I could understand the meaning of this poem. I had to do a little research because the words are not usually I these are words that not I do not usually see in modern English texts.
And to truly confess to this, and if they were actually very difficult for me as well. Many of you know Sophie from previous podcasts. Sophie is from France, and I would say, as a native English speaker, this was a very difficult poem for me to get my head around. In fact, Sophie, you and I have done poetry analyses of other individuals like Baudelaire, and I recently did another one on William Blake. I found this to be actually kind of a hard poem to break down, but I do feel like it was ultimately rewarding. Though I don't, my conclusion about it is sort of tentative, and I hope through this conversation we can resolve what's really going in the poem to a greater degree. What did you think about the difficulty of analyzing this poem? Do you think it was harder than other poems that we've looked at, or did it come to you sort of naturally?
Well, I think the way to understand this poem is to think about to put ourselves in the poet shoes and to imagine ourselves in nature um, being fighting against dark thoughts and and
Yeah,
wishing for hope.
yeah. I mean, in a way, it's a very simple poem, but at the same time, there's a lot more than meets the eye if you really start digging into it. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, it sort of intuitively presents itself about the struggle that we each have with despondency and trying to find hope and keep uh, trying to constantly invoke that muse for whatever our craft is. And you could sum it up that simply, but there's a lot more to this than I think first presents itself. And I think we should just jump into it. And the way that I've thought of structuring our discussion today is to have Sophie read each stanza. And then after the recitation of each stanza, we'll have a little discussion about it. And then we'll put all the puzzle pieces together at the end. Sound good, Sophie?
Yes.
All right. Well, if you would be so kind as to read stanza one.
Okay. When by my solitary hearth I sit, and hateful thoughts enwrap my soul in gloom, when no fair dreams before my mind's eye flit, and the bare heath of life presents no gloom, no bloom, sweet hope, ethereal balm upon me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head.
Wonderfully done. All right. Well, I have many questions and many interjections. Well, why don't you go first, Sophie? Is there anything you'd like to say about this stanza before I get into my commentary and ask you a few questions and get your thoughts?
Um, I think it's very introspective. Uh, I I think it is a person uh, who is contemplating his own thoughts, and he's having existential anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, he thinks about his life, and he compares his life with a bare heath, uh, which presents no bloom. So he doesn't see the perhaps the value of life, and so it's a bit nihilistic, I think, and so he's hoping for uh, someone some to change his mind uh, about his nihilistic thoughts, and to bring him a reason for living.
Exactly. And there's so many parts of this that I want to break down, but I mean, just to dwell on these nihilistic thoughts that he's having. So one of the first notes that I made here is trying to figure out what these hateful thoughts are that he's having. It seemed like he was simultaneously filled with hate, or that he didn't see any prospect of joy in his life. I was wondering if both of those things were going on. And I wonder if he developed some sense of self-loathing as a result of not being able to see the silver lining, as it was, to his particular situation. I didn't know if we wanted to delve any more into a psychological vivisection of what's going on here. It seems like he's battering himself for being so nihilistic, and knows that there's something problematic about that. So there's the initial disappointment with life, and then the further self-destructive tendency to beat oneself up for taking such a negative attitude in the first place. Is that what you got from this stanza?
Yes, but I'm not absolutely sure that it's really guilt that he's thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's more meditative. I think he's observing his own thoughts, and then he realized that his own thoughts are negative, and he's being submerged by the darkness which is inside him.
Yes, I think that's a great way to express it. I also wanted to point out how much I enjoyed you bringing to our attention the word heath. That's not a word that we use very much in America. I guess it's more of a I don't know how common it is in England. It's a bit of a antiquated English word. I actually had to look up what the word heath meant. I'm a little bit embarrassed to say that, but it's an uncultivated tract of land, and it's kind of like a wasteland. And what I don't really hear many poets or many philosophers or anything like that. I mean, I guess there's obviously Eliot and Madison Julian Kylline or whatever, but I think it's kind of unusual to compare one's life to land. I really appreciated the analogy. There's so many other things that I hear people compare their lives to. They'll identify with a character in a movie or a river or something like that, but to an uncultivated tract of land was sort of new to me. Do you see that often in French literature, or do you think about that often, comparing your soul to landscapes?
Well, actually, in the Bible, Jesus tell about bearing fruits.
Yeah, that's true.
Talks
That's
about
true.
this as if we were trees.
That is true. That is true. It is sort of reminiscent of the first fruits of the transformative salvation experience. Yeah, that's a wonderful observation. And obviously, this presents a stark contrast to something like the Garden of Eden, that had all these gifts of creation, and this poet seems to be struggling with no creative fruits. So I think that's very astute to draw those biblical parallels.
It's like the act of creation is what is making us alive.
Yeah, wonderful. Yes, indeed. I think Keats would agree with you.
Yes, and I've been reading a bit, learning a bit about Bergson recently, and he
Oh, I
talks
love
about this
Bergson so
subject
much.
very much. Yes.
What I I highly, if anyone's interested in Bergson, I highly recommend a book called The Physicist and the Philosopher. Bergson's debates with Einstein back in the late teens and early 20s about the theory of relativity. What have you been reading about Bergson lately, Sophie?
I've been listening to several podcasts, and I've been reading the two sources of morality and religion, and I
Did you
really love this book. Yes.
did you find that it was helpful in understanding this poem?
Not this one in particular, but more the creative evolution. Was more related to what we were talking about this notion about how um, the notion of creation, and which is an an expression of a life bearing fruits.
Yes. Well, it seems like it may have helped a little bit because I think it provided you with that great insight that we just covered. So there's always connections to the other things that we're feeding our minds with. Something else I wanted to discuss here is the personification of hope in this first stanza and really throughout the whole poem. And it was a bit perplexing to me because I'm not super familiar with Keats's sort of mystical, pagan, syncretized sort of understanding of the world. And I'm not sure he was either. I mean, he died really young, right? He died, I think, before his 26th birthday, or he was barely 26. So I'm not sure he had enough time to develop a full theological framework. He seems to have inherited a lot of pagan ideas from Ovid. I also know that he translated the Aeneid, and then he had contact with some secondary sources, but he seems to be borrowing a lot of things from antiquity. But here it's kind of unusual because he's speaking to hope as if hope is some sort of angelic being. And I don't know if he is thinking of it as an angel or a muse. I think as time goes on, it becomes more obvious that it's an angel, but where he's getting this sort of angelic reference from, if he's doesn't seem to be that particularly interested in biblical theology. So I thought that was interesting. And to compound the matter, he says in the last two lines of the first stanza, sweet hope, ethereal balm upon me shed, and wave thy silver pinions over my head. So I had to look up what pinions meant. Pinions are like the flight feathers of birds. So we're talking about some sort of winged creature here. So I think that, again, that plays into this Christian angelic archetype. But then also the ethereal balm. I'm really interested in the ether, exploring cosmology and things like that, and bringing things back, like the physicist and the philosopher. The idea of the ether was something that gripped many individuals before Einstein came on the scene with relativity. So I had to look at, I don't know if you know this, but the definition of ether, according to Merriam-Webster, has many different definitions that may enhance our understanding of this poem. Do you mind if I just take a second to share that with the audience?
No, okay, go on.
I'm anxious to see what comes of this. So, definition 1A, the rarefied element formerly believed to fill the upper regions of space. B, the upper regions of space, heaven. 2, a light, volatile, flammable liquid, C4H10O, used chiefly as a solvent and especially formerly as an anesthetic, which I think will be important to our understanding. To be any of a class of organized compounds characterized by an oxygen atom attached to two carbon atoms. 3, or less commonly, ether play a medium that in the wave theory of light permeates all space and transmits transverse waves, be airwaves. So presumably Keats had all these sort of definitions of the ether and things that were ethereal bouncing around in his head. I mean, it could be sort of an immaterial substance, but it also could be part of this heavenly realm that was truly above him, and that we could see sweet hope as this angelic medic that is bringing him something from the heavens, and pouring it over him in order to give him greater insight, greater inspiration to overcome the disappointment of the dark night of the soul. So I just thought that, and it also functions as sort of an anesthetic, as we're learning that it is a chemical compound. I don't know if the idea was that ether may have this dreamlike hallucinatory inducing effect, that this angelic presence may be able to take him away to a fantasy land by the application of this balm upon his head that would allow him to channel some sort of greater poetic insight. So I thought all these definitions were really helpful to try to understand what our subject is going through in this poem. What do you think?
Yes, I watched a documentary from the BBC about the Romantic poets, and that's how I learned about John Keats. And they were saying that he was not, he did not really believe in life after death, but that he was thinking that he could achieve immortality through his art.
So yeah, I think that's probably true. I mean, and you can see. I just watched a movie called Bright Star, which is based off one of his poems. It was about the relationship between him and Fanny Braun, and you can see the upper bourgeois class that's surrounding him, treating him as if he's a brief sort of manifestation of genius that needs to be preserved through his tuberculosis and be remembered for all time because he was sort of like the successor to Shakespeare. There is this idea that he was his legacy, and I think maybe that criticism affected him greatly. His larger epic poems like Endymion or whatever got some mixed reviews and things like that. And one has to wonder how sensitive he was to that criticism and if it hastened his untimely demise. What do you think it was about this particular sense of immortality that Keats grabbed onto, or is that just something that we all go through? I guess I went through it in my past when I was doing music. I desperately wanted to preserve some sort of legacy. Maybe it's just a natural stage of man. What did this BBC documentary let us know about this idea?
I think they were talking about the Romantic movement, and not only they were not only talking about John Keats, and most of them were not really were not Christian, but were searching for meaning of life in art. And so their main values were creativity, imagination, nature, and also a form of individualism. And they thought that feelings defined their identity, and it was a bit of a revolt, a rebellion against the Enlightenment age, which promoted reason as the only the most important feature of human beings. And they say no, emotions are important as well.
Did they say anything? Something in all my research, I've never found anything about why Keats isn't a Christian. I don't see, and I am no Keats scholar. I'm just a dude who reads a lot. And today we're turning our attention to John Keats's poetry, which I have a passing familiarity with. But I have yet to encounter why he outright rejected Christianity. I don't know if they covered that at all. I mean, it's sort of just taken for granted that he was never interested in it. I know for a fact that he was a medical student. I don't think he completed his medical studies. I think that was a great source of guilt for him, especially since he was so destitute, poor, dependent upon benefactors, and pursuing something that was just totally unpragmatic with poetry. But also, I wonder how much, from what I understand, I think he caught a latent form of tuberculosis, if I understand his timeline correctly, from his brother. And I wonder if seeing his brother meet an untimely demise made him not have any sort of hope in Christian immortality or eternity, and if there was any sort of anger at God. Have you had any? Has this been addressed anywhere? Because he seems to he takes so kindly to these pagan forms of goddesses and stuff like that, but very rarely have I encountered any sort of invocation of biblical archetypes.
I think he's been very interested in the subject of death still since infancy, because he lost also his father. I think he lost several people of his family very young.
Mm.
And I think he had a lot of anxiety towards death and losing his people who are close to him.
Well, yeah, I
And
mean,
his own death as well.
that's a whole other kettle of fish. The his poem, "Fears of When I Cease to Be," or something to this effect. I should know it off the top of my head. Let's move on to the second stanza. Would you read the second stanza for us?
Okay. Whene'er I wonder at the fall of night, when woven boughs shut out the moon's bright ray, should sad despondency my musings fright, and frown to drive fair cheerfulness away. Peep with the moonbeams through the leafy roof, and keep that thin despondence far aloof.
Fantastic. So, what were your initial impressions of this stanza?
He personified despondency, cheerfulness, despondence, as if it were creatures.
Mm-hmm.
And also, we imagine a scene in nature. We are outside. There are trees, and it's the night, and the moon rays pass through the trees, and as if we were seeing a fight between creatures, magical creatures.
I love the way that you put that. I love this struggle between different personified spirits. I like
Yeah.
I like how you put that. They seem to be very real to him, and in the first stanza, it looks like when he's invoking Sweet Hope, where you're sort of imagining this winged creature, but then as he's talking about the moon's appearance and how it brings such despondency when it's taken away from him. First of all, I think it's really wonderful that he has so much positive emotion attached to the moon. The moon is oftentimes associated with very macabre things like werewolves and lunatics, right? Like crazy people. But Keats understands that it is a source of cheerfulness. And I don't know about you, but I do like a great deal of star and moon gazing these days. And there are very few things in this world that bring me as much pleasure as looking at the moon and contemplating the moon's light in light of revelations that I've had recently. And it just brings me a great deal of joy to contemplate the starry heavens and the firmament. And so I like to hear Keats saying things like this, because I feel like I have a little bit of a kinship with him when he does that.
Yes, and it seems that the fantastic things, the fantastic events happen during the night.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why whereas during the day you have the ordinary life, and during the night the magical creatures come and and live their life.
Right. Well, something that I thought was sort of interesting is that he seems to be, having this very exciting, ecstatic, mystical experience by the interaction with the moon. And I'm wondering, at first I didn't. I thought he was mixing his metaphors, but it seems to be that this angelic being that he is associating with hope might also be associated with the visage of the moon. I think he might be thinking. I don't think it would be hard to connect these dots, but I think he might be associating hope with the moon, because the moon has this sort of silvery light, and we're talking about the silver pinions over his head. And it's in the ether. It's a celestial object, and it's pouring down on him. I get the sense that he is conflating this personified angelic being with the moon. Did you get that at all? At first I didn't, but when I went back over it again this morning, I thought, you know what? I think that's what he's saying.
Yes, I think the whole poem is a contrast between darkness and light, and so the hope is a creature of light. So is the moon, which has a brightness, and the moon's brightness is hidden by the trees. But I think it's the whole poem is it's about this contrast, this conflict between darkness and light, and it's a conflict within him, because we can understand that in the beginning of the poem we are outside his head, and then it seems that we are entering his head.
Yeah, and that's a really wonderful thing that he's inviting us into, right? Is to be able to.
Yes.
That's one of the things I love about poetry, is how in the process of that you get to really see things from another person's point of view, and that's a very hard thing to do, right? How hard is it? I wonder if one could make the moral case that analyzing poetry would allow you to be a more empathic individual.
Yes, I've been listening to a YouTube video about a girl who said that art was very important to her, because art was for people who are introvert and sensitive. It's the only way to express our rich inner world to the outside world, to other people, and it's a direct communication of these feelings. And I think the most direct form of art, which allows to express a feeling directly from a person to another, is music, I think, because with music you always provoke a feeling to the other person.
Well, Keats would argue with you, because I think he would say in a way that his poetry is music, right? And we'll see that a little bit later on, that I believe
yes,
even.
Of course, but you have the there is not an obstacle, but there is the words between one person and the other, so it's a bit less direct than music.
I see what you're saying, because it is and this raises a very interesting question, right? With music, it's universal. You don't need someone to translate it in order to enjoy it. But I've heard you do French recitations of Baudelaire, and I have no idea what the words are, but your recitations are like music to me. And this raises a very interesting question about what we're enjoying when we're enjoying a piece of poetry. So, like when I listen to one of my own recitations of Baudelaire in English, I'm trying to concretize the concepts that may be latent within the poem, that need to be extracted and brought out. But when I listen to you read it in French, I just kind of go along for the ride, and it does become music to me. And so poetry, I think, even if you don't understand it, conceptually can still be a form of music. And then when you can blend them, if you do understand the words that are being spoken, it has the potential for us to go beyond music, maybe. And this is sort of an eternal sort of debate within aesthetics about what is the highest art form. Some people will say it's sculpture, some people will say it's music, some people will say it's poetry. I doubt we're going to be able to solve that debate in this conversation, but at least we've alluded to it and perhaps problematized it so someone else can explore it. Is there anything else you'd like to say about this before moving on to the next stanza?
I've been thinking about something, but I can't. Yes, it was about my experience of reading poetry, and I think it is not all about the words and the metaphors and all other constructions that the poet is using. It's not all about the technique of poetry. It's also about subjectivity, and I think that's what I'm the most interested in when I read poetry, and that's why I'm attracted to romantic poets like John Keats, because they value subjectivity.
They do. They certainly do. Well, would you read the next stanza for us?
Yes. Should disappointment, parent of despair, strive for her son to seize my careless heart, when like a cloud he sits upon the air, preparing on his spellbound prey to dart, chase him away, sweet hope, with visage bright, and fright him as the morning frightens night.
Very inspired reading of that stanza. I enjoy it. So there's a lot going on in this stanza. I had a lot of commentary, but why don't you go first?
Well, it seems that the dart, it's the I imagine someone throwing a dart to. I imagine the disappointment and despair being fighting using weapons against Keat's careless hearts.
Yeah, I don't think that's a far-fetched image to sum it up. I mean, obviously he wants you to contemplate that, and I don't know. I mean, it enriches life to think about these things in these ways, right? So it's like poetry is a form of virtual reality. It sort of layers over our common lived experience with great metaphor and analogy to make it more lively.
Yes, it seems that he's making he's visualizing his feelings as if they were um, as if they were people or characters. It made me think about Carl Jung as well, because he was talking about this idea of um, making our thoughts and feelings being objective to our, like as if we were looking at them as a third person, looking at our feelings and thoughts as if they were other people.
Yeah, and that's thinking about our thoughts and feelings as people can have interesting philosophical payout. Like if we look here at the first couple of lines of stanza 3, should disappointment, parent of despair, strive for her son to seize my careless heart, when like a cloud he sits upon the air. I think that's an interesting psychological insight in here, that disappointment generates despair or begets despair. Do you think that is a correct psychological analysis, or can despair beget disappointment, or does it skip a generation? Can it be cyclical in some way? What did you think about that?
I think it is very common in people who are idealistic, and when we are idealistic, we see how the world should be. in our minds, and then we try. If we see that the world is not how it should be, we want to try to take action to make it closer to our ideals. And very often it's we realize that our efforts will not be successful. We won't be successful in achieving the level uh, to which we are aiming, and we realize that we will probably never uh, we will probably never be successful in this attempt. And
Well, that is if we don't have hope, right? And
yes,
it looks like Keats. What's interesting, the last three lines of stanza 3, preparing on his spellbound prey to dart. So I get the sense that Keats is again, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but because of this interaction with the moonlight, is having one of his sort of ecstatic experiences, and that it is sort of paralyzing him in a way because he's taken to another place. Like, that's why he uses the term spellbound, and that he hopes that sweet hope with visage bright. And when you think about visage, that means face. And from the human perspective, and even with the terrestrial telescopes, if you look at the moon, it has a face, you know? And I think what he's trying to say here is that this angelic being that he's associating with the face of the moon is paralyzing him into some sort of mystical experience where he is retaining hope and allowing him to ward off disappointment and despair. Now, maybe he's just being very dramatic and flowery about it, but it also could be a very real thing that this is how he regenerates his spirit, is by going out into night and, I guess, imagine that he's encountering this being that is associated with the moon. What is that? Is that just an insane interpretation of what's going on here, or is he
no,
is he just dramatizing his feelings?
no, it seems that to be like a mystical experience, like you said. And what it made me think about is when you a bit like, the allegory of the cave of Plato. When you do experience the world of the forms, in the case of the allegory of the cave, when you experience the ideal world, then if you experience the more the earth, the earthly world, then you can see the contrast, the sharp contrast between the two. And when someone can experience the highest joy and the highest ecstasy, then he also experiences darkness and sadness and despair more intensely than other people.
I think that's a wonderful insight, and I do think we should take Keats at his word when what he's talking about here, because I don't think he would have. I don't know if he would have written it if he wasn't authentic about it. What's interesting is it seems like Keats, in his very short life, had begun to free himself from the cave that all of us are born into, the enslavement, the shows, had begun to free himself, and that he was using a lot of these pagan ideas to make the transition into the contemplation of the ideal world. But he didn't live long enough to actually fully actualize it. Like, I wonder if Keats had lived longer, if he would have become a philosopher, a theologian. This invoking these gods and goddesses and muses and things like that seem to be maybe a transitional stage to what he ultimately would have come into as a realization of the ultimate reality. What do you think about that idea?
We'll never know.
We'll never know.
Yes,
You're like,
perhaps.
let me conduct a seance, Luke. Let me channel John Keats and see what he has to say.
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
But
I was.
doesn't it seem like he's on his way?
Yes, I think he's having a he's searching for answers to his existential question. I think he's thinking deeply about uh, the questions about the meaning of life, and also he's I think he had real mystical experiences, but he could not make sense of them, and he was in a quest of searching for their meaning. And but yes, he didn't have time to go further, but he already had an answer in a beginning of answer in poetry when he was expressing himself, and he was it was an act of creation which made him feel alive, and it was a beginning of answer for him.
Agreed. Would you like to read the next stanza for us?
Yes. Whenever fate of those I hold most dear tells to my fearful breast to tell of sorrow, O bright-eyed hope, my morbid fancy cheer, let me awhile thy sweetest comforts borrow, thy heaven-born radiance around me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head.
That's a beautiful stanza. And I think I don't really have anything new to add to this stanza. I think it's just further evidence that he is interpreting them as sort of celestial angelic entity that is providing this ethereal balm to him that allows him to escape the despondency of real life. I didn't have any new ideas that I wanted to share with this. What about you? But I just thought it was beautiful.
I wonder if he's thinking about the people, his relatives who died, and
Yeah.
and also the fear of losing other people in his life. I think this stance is about this fear of losing close people who are close to him, and so he's asking his hope angel to comfort him.
That's a very good point. What I wonder if Kierkegaard had read Keats at all. Would be very interested if he did, and how that figured into his conception of the poet. You know, Kierkegaard. We think it. We sort of where we live in an age where so few of us experience. We live in a pretty comfortable age where so few of us we don't experience death like these greats did, and how much that experience of death at a young age and cryptic disease at a young age and dying young, how much that fueled their creative genius. It's not that I wish for that, but it does seem to be this common thread that goes through a lot of greats. And I wonder if there's some virtue in studying the greats, if we can get in touch with their loss. And even though we wouldn't want that for ourselves in our reality, maybe it can be a precipitant for us to create even greater things. I mean, obviously we don't want to be surrounded by death or be crippled or die young or any of that, but maybe there is some benefit to reading about their melancholy and what they had to endure. What do you think it's creative at all? Or do you think that's helpful at all?
Yes, it makes me think about how I feel when I'm surrounded by the when I am with the people from who I work with, or from a family generally I have this feeling that people around me are quite superficial. They care very much about earthly things, and they are very much in the moment, and they can enjoy themselves uh, by through having parties, or they are very hedonistic, most of them. Or if they are not hedonistic, they care about their work. And I am often thinking, um, if the maybe the fact that they haven't been confronted to death um, may be the cause of this superficiality of their uh,
Well, I know a lot of people who have experienced loss and death at a very young age, and they are driven into the mystic lifestyle as a form of escapism.
yes, also perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
I
And
don't think it's I think there is another layer to this. I think people like Keats and Kierkegaard, it's not only that they lost a lot of people, but also that they were more sensitive than the average individual.
well, it's a chicken and the egg question, right? Which came first? You
I
know,
think I think both.
something that I read about Keats because I'm preparing to do another poetry analysis on Endymion. From what I understand, he didn't really care for poetry until the last bit of his life. He was in medical school, and if the historical record that I've encountered is correct, he liked sports and he liked fighting.
Yeah, I've been learning this too, but it seems that he went to medical school because he was not rich, and so he was not like the other romantic poets who came from rich families and who didn't have to work. And I think that's the reason why he did these studies. He wanted to have a job to have money, but
I wonder
and
what I wonder what caused the change in him. Do you
I I
when
think
he was
he
in medical school?
I think from what from the podcast I listened to, uh, they said that he actually he finished his studies, but he realized that it was not his vocation. That his calling was to be a poet, and
Oh,
he made a leap of faith and tried to and went on being a poet, even if it was not expected from someone from his background, because he was not a privileged from a privileged family.
I wonder if that calling to be a poet emerged sort of organically through his studies and then becoming acquainted with some poetry books, or if he felt some sort of revelatory call. Did address any of the educational materials that you investigated?
I don't know about this.
Yeah,
I
that's
should
fine.
have learned more about him, but
Well,
that's the only thing I know.
I've done a ton of research, and I still have a lot of questions that are unanswered. So, and he may have taken those answers to the grave.
But I can relate to this personally. This idea of I did these studies in engineering, in IT engineering,
That's
and
right. That's right.
when I decided to choose this career, I was thinking rationally. I was thinking, yes, this is a. I am interested in IT, in computer science. I am intellectually interested in this, and it is a safe job. There are a lot of the job markets is good for in this sector. So I'm going to do this because it seems that the most rational choice. for me. And as I am not a practical person, I will be good at it, because I'm not good at using my hands and to do practical things, but uh, I'm good at intellectual tasks. So it may be a good way for me to earn a living. And then when I started to enter the corporate world, this idea of a calling, of maybe having a vocation, something more to life, occurred to me. And I wonder if it was the same for Keat. Uh, when he finally finished his studies, he realized that he wanted more.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. I started college thinking I was going to be a medical doctor, or maybe as a backup, a veterinarian, and then philosophy courses were hoisted upon me, and the rest is history. The rational aspect of my schooling evaporated. I tried. I mean, I double majored in biology and philosophy, but the philosophy won out, and yay, have a philosophy PhD now. Oh man, if only I had retained that practical path, just be rolling it. So
you regret
no,
this?
well, that's a whole other conversation about what
Okay.
philosophy leads us to. And my life isn't over yet. I got a lot of years left, so maybe that philosophy education will, in some ironic way, lead to more financial stability than the medical degree ever could have. We'll see. It's a very volatile world right now. A lot of change is happening, so we'll see. How about you read the next stanza for us?
Okay. Should e'er unhappy love my bosom pain, from cruel parents or relentless fare, oh, let me think it is not quite in vain to sigh out sonnets to the midnight air. Sweet hope, ethereal balm upon me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head.
So I really like this stanza because what it seemed like to me is that his poems, his sonnets, take on a religious sort of significance where he is simultaneously, he's in this dynamic relationship with this personified hope angel figure, where he is on the one hand seeming to invoke it with his poems, and at the same time glorify it as a result of getting the inspiration from it. It's all very pagan, but at the same time, if I step outside of my Christian skin, I can see that there's something very valuable about this. That he's trying his hardest to get in touch with this spiritual ideal through his art form. And to think about Keats sighing out his sonnets in the midnight air, I mean, that's just something people don't do. But to literally think that he may have been shouting these towards the heavens is a really dramatic image. I wonder if there's a painting of it somewhere. If I was a painter, I would paint this.
This whole poem would make a great paint, or several paintings. I think each stance could be a painting.
If you were a painter, how would you paint it?
First, the first stance, I would paint a man sitting in front of a hearth, and outside. I think I would make such a kind of fantastic atmosphere, and that he's and somehow show that we enter his head, and in his head there is the the heath, the bare heath, and then the night comes and the moon and the creatures fighting each other, and and then we.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
I
I
think
love
it
it.
would be more a movie than a painting, or I don't know.
Well, you definitely could do an interesting artistic interpretation of this. You could make a short film off of it easily.
Yes.
That's good. That's about all I had to say for that stanza. Would you like to say anything else and read the next one?
I would like to say that I think this stance is all about existential angst. I think he's asking himself about his vocation, about of being a poet. When he says,
Oh
uh,
yeah, yeah.
"Let me think it is not quite in vain to sigh out sonnets to the midnight air." So perhaps he is questioning his own vocation. He's thinking, is it really worth it? Am I really doing what I'm supposed to do? Um, and he's the
He's look.
two.
It's almost
Yeah,
like he's looking. It's almost like he's consulting an oracle. You know, I've been
yeah.
doing some research. The
He's
role that the
thinking,
Delphic.
I'm miserable in this life, and I'm searching. I'm trying to achieve meaning through being a poet. But is this really what I'm supposed to do?
Yeah, I completely agree. The next couple stanzas, maybe you should go ahead and read the next two stanzas because they take kind of a unanticipated turn. I didn't have a sense of. Would you mind reading both of them?
Okay, I'll read both of them. In the long vista of the years to roll, let me not see our country's honor fade. Oh, let me see our land return her soul, her pride, her freedom, and not freedom's shade. From thy bright eyes unusual brightness shed, beneath thy pinions canopy my head. Let me not see the patriot's heights bequest, great liberty, how great in plain attire, with the base purple of a court oppressed, bowing her head and ready to expire. But let me see thee stoop from heaven on wings that fill the skies with silver glitterings.
Well done. All right, so this was difficult for me, Sophie, and I'm just I want to get your take on this, okay? Because you know the first three or four stanzas we're talking about a man who's trying to ward off despondency and despair by consulting his angelic oracle that beams down from the moon with this ethereal balm, and then all of a sudden he starts talking about political freedom. And that
Yes.
seemed to be quite the break in theme. And I don't know the historical context of what's going on here, but he seems to be bemoaning the possible loss of the freedoms that I guess England held dear. I don't know if this is the result of having a brother in America. He's living in the aftermath of the Revolutionary War in America. He's living in the aftermath of the War of 1812. And I can't help but think, because there is this unusual tension that's going on in England, because England was a monarchy that sort of had a constitutional republic spring up underneath of it with parliament. It wasn't, it didn't always have parliament. And don't ask me to go into depths about the historical evolution of the political system because I'm not an English historian. But
Yeah.
the way that I read this is that it seems like he's worried that the freedoms that are enjoyed in England may be bowing to the throne, and he's concerned about the legacy of that. but I could be totally off base here. What do you think?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't know very much about his political views and the historical context, but it seems that that he was very much concerned about the future of his country.
I didn't even
And
know he had political feelings. I don't really think of him as a political figure.
yes, well, I think as a thinker, he he was perhaps more than the other romantic poets, as he was less rich than them. He was more concerned uh, with the reality of the existence of people around him.
Yeah, I want to see who. I wonder if we can, if quickly. I should have looked this up, but John died. He was born in 1795 and died in 1821. And just a quick Google search, it says that George III was King of Great Britain and King of Ireland uh, uh, till 1801. Let's see, who was king in 1815? Maybe it's a queen. Do you know?
I don't know. I was looking at an article about politics and poetry and poetic, a comparative study of John Keats and I don't know his name, Lee. Uh,
Was it Lee Hunt? Was that who it was?
Lee, Lihe,
Uh-huh.
and it talks about their political opinions. Uh,
Right. Well, it was either George III or George IV. If I really should have researched beforehand. Um, but I can imagine, obviously Americans had problems with uh, George III, if I understand the timing of this correctly. I wonder what the sentiment of George III was from a homegrown perspective. Well, I'll have to get back to people on that. Maybe not so good if he got defeated in the Revolutionary War in the War of 1812. I don't know.
it seems that Keats uh, uh, was against the English Church and the conservative government and the
So
decadence of the ruling classes and no, the decadence of the ruling classes was Lee attack, so it's not Keats, but Keats was more against the conservative government and also reactionary institutions. So his main concern was freedom and also he feared tyranny. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, maybe he was concerned with colonialism. I don't even know. Lots of speculation here, but I just think it's an interesting about face for this poem. But then it's sort of brought home in the final stanza. At would you care to finish this off for us?
yes, I'm going to read the last stanza of this beautiful poem. And as in sparkling majesty a star gilds the bright summit of some gloomy cloud, brightening the half-veiled face of heaven afar, so when dark thoughts my body's spirit shroud, sweet hope, celestial influence round me shed, waving thy silver pinions over my head.
I'm hesitant to even say anything. I almost want to end with that, but I think what we can say is that Sweet Hope, the celestial influence, not only is a curative for his personal despondency, but also when the weight of his country and the government that he is encountering weighs a little too heavily on him, that Sweet Hope is a welcome balm for those afflictions as well.
Yes, I think he managed to achieve some hope in the end of the poem.
Yeah. It is a very positive note.
And that he knows that now he can reach this feeling whenever he's having his dark thoughts again, that his angel of hope will come if he is calling him.
I think that's fantastic. Well, I think, you know what, I think we covered a lot of ground. I think you know what was, I mean, we talked about so many things that I didn't anticipate in this, Sophie. I mean, and that's what's really wonderful about having these conversations with you, and I hope that other people will imitate, is that no matter how much you think you understand a work of literature or a poem or something like that, when you get in a brilliant mind room to bounce ideas off of, so many new things are introduced, right? I mean, like what you brought up with Henri Bergson and creative evolution, and how creativity is what causes our life to blossom. I really enjoyed just the imagery and the cinematic understanding you have of this poem. The great conversation we had about the ranking of the art forms and what is it about poetry that makes it so great, and if it's higher than music, or can it be higher than music on some occasion? I mean, you really introduced incredible thought-provoking themes, and I can't thank you enough. Those would have never have occurred to me had you not been present for this. So I just want to thank you for sitting down and talking with me today.
And thank you so much for inviting me to do this, because if I didn't know you, I don't think I would have this idea if I was alone. I don't think I would be able to do this kind of video. I think I like the fact that we are having a conversation, and also you give me ideas. You inspire me.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad. That brings me happiness to know that it's a two-way street. And if you would like to join us, you can listen on the Noetic app and noetic.online. You can beta test, and don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can reach me over at noetic.online, and who knows? I mean, maybe we have someone listening right now that would want to participate with us one day during one of these poetry analyses. And you can write me at philosophyluke@gmail.com if you're hesitant about joining another social media website. But we're trying to create an intellectual atmosphere where people can develop relationships over ideas and topics of this nature, to give us a more enlightened form of social media. So feel free to join us over at noetic.online. All right, Sophie, I've got to eat some lunch.
We'll going to eat dinner.
All right. I'll talk to you soon.
Goodbye, and goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.